when I accepted roles within this industry that I'm in now, payments where I'd grown up around, it felt like I was reverting to a base level entry role. So I was on telesales or on the phones just as a bank of 10 people at desks. And it kind of felt like I already sort of was growing up around this person in payments that had senior roles in big companies. And I was trying to think in my head, how do I emulate a career like this? How do I look towards my mum at that time and as someone I would like to become in terms of a manager, a people person, a man manager. She was very good at looking after teams and building teams, seeing them progress in their roles. And I was seeing a conflict in this because the roles at that time that I was working in an office, I had managers that were very different, that seemed harsh, that seemed uninterested, that seemed rude, that sort of talked down to you like you were children rather than adults. And I was this like early.
Thank you so much for clicking on this episode of The Millennial Entrepreneur. The ambition of the podcast is to show relatable stories from young entrepreneurs doing some incredible things to inspire the next generation, including you listening wherever you are. We've been doing this podcast for over 3 years and the ambition has not changed. The only thing that has changed is the scale of where we want to go. We want to bring on bigger guests for you guys to show more and more relatable and inspiring stories from young entrepreneurs across the world. The majority of you guys listening haven't subscribed to the podcast yet. All you have to do is click that subscribe button wherever you're listening on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and that will allow us to bring on bigger guests and ask the questions to them that you really want to hear. And it really is that simple. So thank you again for clicking on the podcast and enjoy the episode. Hey Ciaran, how are you?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. It's amazing to have you on the podcast. And I can't wait to talk about payments. Like we've met a lot of times before, and yeah, really looking forward to talking about payments because you come from a very different background to what I've had on the podcast before, and that's a very interesting story. So I guess like before we jump in, what's your sort of like background? Like I guess this is going back to say like childhood because you did start fairly young in this.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm fortunate in a way actually that I grew up around payments. So I work in payments, mainly supporting businesses with accepting card payments face to face, but also online. But I grew up with a mum who started in the industry in the late 90s, working with some of the banks and retailers and businesses to help them process payments. This is quite early on in people having chip and pin machines and most businesses having a chip and pin machine or a card payment facility. And then as my childhood progressed and I got into secondary school, my mum was in the industry and at that time had a role for a payment processor where she was working from home predominantly at the beginning. Big old fashioned bulky computer in the living room. And so I'd come in with my backpack and be, with my brothers in the living room and she'd still be working till 6 p.m. But we'd have a sort of couple-hour window where I could overhear and I'd hear conversations or sort of names of banks, names of payment processors, who she was working with. So the terminology was starting to sink in even as a teenager. So it was like my early teens. So then, as I finished my GCSEs, at this stage, my mum had progressed with that particular bank to head up a UK office and run it near where we were based, where we grew up in Lincolnshire, and look after all the applications. And back then, this is 2007. It was paper packs. Everything was wet signed. We didn't have e-signature docs, and it wasn't as simple. So, the idea being that rather than post a paper pack in from a sales rep and then send it off to the bank and it have a load of errors and it could have been checked as an interim position, my mum ran a sort of an operations team and a scrubbing team that just checked in and that was all correct and above board and then sent it to the bank. So there was no sort of getting it wrong and it coming back and wasting time. So as soon as I finished on the Friday, my last GCSE, Monday morning last summer was Monday to Friday, working in that office, checking paper packs, speaking to sellers, checking the signatures on all the pages, about 7 or 8 signatures needed on the different forms, and just making sure it was all correct for the bank, really. So that was my first introduction, other than just sat in the living room and hearing it, actually working and seeing how would I go about getting an application processed. That helped me. I went to do my A-levels. But then that helped me already know after my A-levels, if I became a field seller at 18, as soon as I could, I already knew how to process a paper application and how to fill one out. So all I had to do is go and speak with business owners myself and talk about the different price points and the different terminals at that time, and then complete the paperwork and send it into the office. So that's what I did. I got the opportunity at 18 to sit on a training course, spent a week learning. Already knew a lot of it because I'd grown up around it, but then it actually just got me, ready to go out in the field on my own in my car, look after businesses around Lincoln, around different sort of cities like Scunthorpe and Grimsby and different places in around Lincolnshire where I grew up, and speak to business owners and help them. And I guess when we talk about sort of a later sort of progression with my company at the moment, where I'm founder and MD, was that I realized as an 18-year-old, I was encouraging business owners to switch and trust me for their payment processing. They'd been in business decades. I was this young kid. So now I'm in my mid-20s. Why couldn't I start my own brand and encourage merchants to join that brand and payment process? So I already sort of given myself the sort of the conviction in my mind that I could go out and attract more business owners to my brand.
You were 18 though, so yeah, it makes sense. So you were like working alongside your mum, I guess, when you finished your GCSEs, and then as time went on, like what pushed you at 18 to go into sort of field sales within payments? Was it literally just like the money aspect?
Partly the money aspect, partly because actually what I wanted to do as a career, what I wanted to do when I left school really was do acting. So I was doing a lot of the audition circuits. I had an agent in London. I was going to auditions often last minute. So the ability to be sort of self-employed and go and run a diary and have sales applications, but be able to actually be away at an audition for a day and then go back. I didn't have to be regimented into a 9 to 5. So that's the benefit and the beauty of self-employed. You run it around your life. It's a work-life balance. And at that time, as 18, I didn't have a mortgage. I didn't have all of these pressures on me. So I didn't need thousands of pounds a month. I'm still living with parents, so yeah, it made sense to try that and see how I got on with it and enjoyed it.
But then when you turn 19, because it's funny because you construct your life together for that
Yeah,
flexibility in order to
yeah.
sort of prioritize the acting side of things. But then your life like changed for the good.
When I was 19, I became a dad. So that was, at 18, found out that my girlfriend at the time, my son's mother, was pregnant. She was 16, I was 18. This was very quick. This wasn't planned, and this happened. And it was right. Well, you have to grow up now, or you have to stand by this relationship, this child. You have to figure out you're going to live together, so you're going to have to get rent for the first time and bills, and you've got this baby in the mix, and you've got family, and it's all great. Look, my family and parents, although very surprised because this was not planned, they expected me to go on and either go to university or have a career and then do it the right way, or when I say the right way, sort of like timed correctly. They were very, very supportive. As soon as Riley was born, they've been fantastic grandparents, doting grandparents. So that's been brilliant. But it still meant that I had to try and figure out, well, how do I become a dad and look after this child, or put food on the table, or what do I do for a career to progress it? When a lot of friends just couldn't really wrap their heads around that. So that again, it has its own challenges that you sort of become in a way alienated from friends because you're in a completely different scenario all of a sudden. It's like, oh my god, you've seen Ciaran's got a child and he's a dad already. But yeah, for me, Riley's 13 this summer. We have a fantastic relationship. I'm early 30s, and I've got this son who's at the same secondary school as me now already, so I can really understand what he's going through each week. So yeah, it's a good position to be in now.
But like at the time, of course, you were very young, 18 years old, and you prioritize flexibility in your life in order to sort of pursue an acting career. But as you said, your life just changes at that point because you have to provide for a family. And so in terms of like life priorities, what kind of changed at that point? Like what sort of like were you still in field sales? Did you decide to like pivot your life? You didn't go to university, but like yeah, what happened at that stage?
Yeah, it influenced it. So although myself and Riley's mum separated sort of 18 months later, um, I'd moved into a salaried office-based role for consistency. I knew the salary was coming in. I knew I had commission targets. I knew I could sell over the phone as well as field sales. So it was in this industry, but it was based on a phone in an office. So yeah, that was a decision I had to make at the time, like you say, against that flexibility, because it was like, well, you have to be sensible or serious now. And I was just trying to figure out how this career could pan out, or could I go do something else? And at the time, that was kind of a similar time where I stopped acting. I stopped it was very hard to have a sick day or a holiday day last minute to go to an audition and pay travel to London or Manchester to miss out on earnings in an office role that I needed. So I'd started to get commitments. So that's where the two worlds started to separate, and then I was focused on more of a career.
So then your son was born, and then I guess like how did life progress at that point?
I had a moment at 22 in the summer where I felt like I'd been positioned into this industry. I'd now lost the flexibility and I was being sensible and serious, but I was, in a way, sort of frustrated by that. So I knew I wanted to go on and achieve it. I knew I wanted to, push myself. I didn't want to accept just a base salary or a safety net. I never really liked the idea of doing this throughout my 20s and my 30s. So at that time, I actually just reached out to a lot of families and campsites in France, south of France. Heard back and drove my car from Lincolnshire straight through to the south of France and lived for a summer working on a campsite and just trying to speak a bit of French and get away from an office environment, away from sales targets, and try to figure out. I had this 2-year-old son at this time, and just trying to understand all of that. When you go through a separation as parents or young parents as well, there's a lot to organize, a lot to resolve between you. There's a lot, it depends on your relationship. We have a fantastic relationship now, and we co-parent really well. But as early 20s or late teens and a bit of friction and tension there's a lot to figure out. So yeah, France, and then came back straight into a state agency, and then driving ambulances on blue lights again. So yeah, a bit different.
It sounds like, Kieran, though, like the reason why you left the phone sales role and then you went to France and then you came back and you did all these different random roles. It sounded like, I guess, life definitely changed for you, but I guess like you didn't have that fulfillment within that phone sales role, and so you were trying to like search around, and obviously like separating with a partner. That given you separated so young, like that's another thing, is because if you're with her for a long time, she kind of becomes part of your identity as well. So like you lose a part of your identity there. So like there's a lot of different things here in terms of like what's going on in your life, and so yeah, how are you kind of feeling between that like time frame, because there's just like so many things.
Quite conflicted. There's one side of me that when I accepted roles within this industry that I'm in now, payments, where I'd grown up around, it felt like I was reverting to um, a base level entry role, right? So I was on a telesales or on the phones, just as a bank of 10 people at desks. And it kind of felt like I already sort of was growing up around this person in payments that had senior roles in big companies. And I was trying to think in my head, how do I emulate a career like this? How do I looked towards my mum at that time, and as someone I would like to become in terms of a manager, a people person, a man manager. She was very good at looking after teams and building teams, seeing them progress in their roles. And I was seeing a conflict in this, because the roles at that time that I was working in an office, I had managers that were very different, that seemed harsh, that seemed uninterested, that seemed rude, that sort of talked down to you like you were children rather than adults. And I was this like early 20s and I had my own child. So there's this real conflict between how do I get there and where I am right now, and in the middle of this, I'm trying to figure out relationships, child, and sort of fatherhood. Your own pressures from even like your own parents thinking, well, you've made this decision, or this has happened, or what are you going on? You're not gone to university. What are you going to do? So there's a lot of conflict there, but I was always confident that I'd figure a way through it, and or at least push myself. I wasn't going to just sit there and settle and sit and just keep turning up week after week at that office.
That essentially is what pushed you to start your own business, because you were very unfulfilled in that role. You had all these different pressures, and Yeah, it can be very challenging because you feel like you don't belong in this stage of your life.
That's definitely it, because it felt like when I looked around, so in the telesales role, I started CIP at 26. So at 25, I was back in a telesales role in the industry, working alongside some of the same people in my early 20s. Although I'd had a couple of years out or a few years out, they were still in that role. So it for me, it had justified in my head that this will be the reality, because those same people are still in this office 3-4 years on, and I've got an
Because
experience
you
so
went
much.
after you came back from France, did those random jobs. You went back to the same exact role.
Exactly. So I did a few different roles and jobs. I loved driving blue lights and ambulances, but it turned into a lot of night shifts. And at that time, it just felt like I'd met somebody new and got married at 25. We're getting our first house, and it felt like weekends and evening and night shifts was not right. And I could go back to an office role and go straight back in as commission targets and get a sensible 9 to 5. Um, but within that first year, we're seeing managers that come in or work under managers that I already looked at and realized I had so much more experience of this industry than, and knew more about it. And so I was thinking, well, how they've got this opportunity, how do I climb the management ladder? And I did try it at that company before I set up CIP. I did try to present to some of the sort of management team and some of the directors sort of ideas on social media and how we could build a brand, and how brand building around a payments company could be useful in the future. And it kind of fell on deaf ears. I was just left in that telesales room, and that's sort of, for me, frustrated me a little bit, because I'd put time in outside of work to build that deck and presentation and try show myself. But everything happens for a reason. So then I got to the point where I was like, right, well, I sat down, I was thinking about it anyway. I spoke to my mum. I said, I think I can build a brand of my own and start from scratch and start something. I know how to sell. I know how to do field sales, telesales, applications. I can speak to different departments and banks. And there wasn't a big no. There was a, yeah, I think you probably could. Not that they were going to financially invest in me or anything. There was no investment there, but there was definitely a, yeah, I can make some introduction. I can help you if you want to do that. You can get started. So that's how I started CIP, and left that full-time role last month's paycheck and some credit cards that I could use. And that was kind of living off those for the next sort of 6 to 9 months and just getting by and taking the minimum I could.
Kieran, when I have people on the podcast, like they're obviously, this is a podcast for young entrepreneurs, and the reason why like a lot of the young people on the podcast start a business is because, and you ask them, you speak to them, they always say, you're young, you've got no real like risk, responsibilities, and things like that. The position that you were in, though, you did have responsibilities. You had a child, you had a relationship, you had a mortgage. These are a lot of responsibilities that someone has to uphold. And so for you starting this business where you know you you don't know, it's still uncertain, right? Because you don't know whether it will take off. That, like, how do you kind of like mentally prepare yourself and to quit your job in order to like start CIP?
The pressures that I had on, so quite a few other people I spoke to and other founders and young entrepreneurs, young founders say to me, I'd love to do it, or people that would like to be entrepreneurs, I'd love to do it, but we're hoping to have a baby, or I'm due to get married next year, or I've got our first mortgage. And they're always blockers. But the month we set CIP up was the first month mortgage payment I had of my first ever mortgage. So I'd been married the summer before. We were moving into our first house. We got our first mortgage. So I had a 6-year-old son from a previous relationship I was obviously contributing to and seeing. So yeah, there was a lot of pressure there still but would have put other people off. But what I saw was there's only upside. So the downside is it doesn't work, and I can definitely 100% go get another of these roles in an office and be on telesales, and I'll be on the same base salary with targets. So for my mind, it was there's only upside. So why don't I try it now? If not now, when? and it just didn't make sense to not do it.
That 100% makes sense. So, like, where did the idea for CIP come from? Like, how did you actually start it?
Again, it's kind of amalgamation of knowing I could start a brand. I wanted it to be transparent for business owners, so I knew that I wanted to support them with understanding there's more options out there for payments nowadays. I don't just have to go with the bank or the high street bank, and I don't have to stay with the option they've got at the minute. They could save money elsewhere, or there might be some fees that are unnecessary. And then also I wanted to give them that ongoing support. So there's a lot of promises made around this time, 5, 6 years ago, of great price, but then you never see the sales rep again, and there's no support or technical support, and there's a lot of friction and frustration. So I felt, can we be more transparent up front? Can we build long-term relationships and look after merchants that have great reputation? And then the idea was that a kid starting out on his own, or at this point mid-20s, no previous business experience. Well, it needs to kind of be professional. So I want it to be credible. So card industry professionals, we're going to try and make sure that we are, professional and transparent and supportive.
You want to be professional, so you put professional in the name.
Yeah, I want to pressure and put pressure in the name, and now really look at that every time I have to type in at cardindustryprofessionals.co.uk, and it's a mouthful. I just think, I should have picked something shorter. But yeah, so that's why it's CIP. So everyone refers to it as CIP, which is good. It rolls off the tongue. A lot of merchants know it as CIP. And so yeah, I was in the point where the brand was ready. I spoke with my mum at the time and said, could I work with another company that had a partnership with the bank, so I wouldn't get my own direct partnership with zero experience and zero customers? You've got to have a little bit more than that. But you could work with a company that had and refer business in and show and use your brand and build your reputation that way. So I did that for the first year. And then it was a year in that I actually sat with Lynn and John. So Lynn's my mum, and John, who's our sales director, and said, I'll split this company 3 ways, and I'll give you each a third of the shares, and you'll be operations director, and you'll be a sales director, and I'll be founder director, which has now become since then managing director. And we'll work with the banks for the next 6 months and have contracts by the start of 2019. We want to have direct contracts with the banks. We want to put business through. We want to get revenue from the banks for every transaction processed. And that's what we did. We had a number of direct contracts with banks by Q1 2019. Including some of the biggest names in the world, like iZettle, who are owned by PayPal. They've been acquired by PayPal for billions.
Yeah, and that's my next question is like, so how did you actually do that? Like, how did you actually like strike up these deals and partnerships?
So by this time we had a brand. We were a year in. I knew quite quickly that if we were going to be credible, I needed to ask for Trustpilot reviews. I needed to show that we were giving and delivering on that service. I needed to be consistent with social and have this brand and this sort of similar sort of message go out across social channels that, it's just you put in a few posts a week up initially, use free social channels, build a basic website, nothing fancy, didn't cost much at all, but at least there was something credible. So then these banks go and look at you and check you out. They can see you've got Trustpilot reviews from customers. They can see what you're trying to do and what you're about. And then obviously sitting and negotiating with the banks is saying, well, we can commit to X amount of sales per month. They want the sales, so you just discuss commercial terms with them. But we're fortunate, I think, as well, because of Lynn and John's experience, that nearly every bank we spoke to presented an offer or commercial discussion, said we'd like you to partner with us. So at that point, it gave us options, and then it was just the turnaround time for Q1 to get going.
So within that space of like the year, so the idea was to create like a better service for the merchants.
Mm-hmm.
When you say better service, like were you focusing more on, so like this comes down to the whole thing of like how do you differentiate yourself from I guess like what's already out there in terms of existing solutions? Like were you thinking of the more personal experience in terms of like putting more like man hours in order to like exist the relationship, or were you thinking can you do a better like software, or like what was the sort of like idea in terms of like what's kind of lacking in the industry already?
It was at that time, and it's still very much the case today, the majority of the traditional banks and the major players have one solution, one price point. Very often they can flex their rates and their pricing, but you kind of take it or leave it and you're shoehorned into it. And we wanted to use these relationships with different banks. And at the time we started with 3, we've now got 4 that we work with directly to at least tailor the solution to the business owner. So the florist who's next door to the hairdresser, who's next door to a restaurant, they've got very different business profiles. They'll probably need a different card machine or price tariff for each one. But if they all 3 of them went to the bank, it'd be very much the same machine with similar price point. So it was like, can we go and tailor a solution? Because you're coming to me as the hair salon saying you've got this particular pain point. Well, we know that this bank removes that pain point. So here's why we're going to use that bank. We'll remove that pain point, and here's the pricing, here's the fees. And then that's where, the 5-star reviews come from.
How would you get the different banks before you get those customers?
So that was where it came down to negotiating with them all. We spoke to a number of them and just cherry picked ones that we felt had the best USPs to complement one another. Some were software based, some obviously like iZettle or Zettle by PayPal are fantastic for software, fantastic for sort of businesses in hospitality and food and beverage. Whereas, other banks we work with like Elavon or Evo Payments had different USPs and price points, but are fantastic for retail or for service sector, like an MOT garage that wanted just a chip and pin machine, but wanted to know what they were paying. And we were up against banks and people that treated them as a number of one of many rather than a name. So again, that service level, if you can make them feel a little bit more special, keep that relationship ongoing, get the 5-star review and keep checking in on them, then they refer business friends or family to you, and it just kind of evolves from there, really. But I knew as soon as I got 1, I could get 2, then 2 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, and just replicate it from there, really.
So how did you get, this is probably like one of the last questions I'll wrap up, because I don't want to go too deep, because I come from a B2B as well. Like I'm in B2B right now, and it's like when I like getting into that. So in terms of, so how did you get your first like initial customer groups? That's often the most difficult.
The first straight away was me in a backpack. So I was, replying to emails in an evening, but trying to walk around in the daytime around towns, go to speak to the hairdresser or the florist and say, look, can I look at your bill and your pricing? I can do the paperwork and sign you up. I was fortunate that quite a few of them, again, because I knew at 18 years old I'd sold for another bank. It's relationships, people buy from people, and I could speak to them, they could trust me, I'd delivered on that service, I'd get the 5-star review. And then I'd use in my evenings LinkedIn mainly to message other resellers, other companies, and say, look, here's what I'm trying to do, or what we're trying to do at CIP. Here's some of the banks we're working with and the USPs. Like, can you go to your merchants and take away these pain points at the minute? No. Come work with CIP, and then you can go out there and earn commission and sell this. So I knew, probably because I had the perspective of being a field seller, I knew how you operated day to day. I knew that I didn't want sellers, and there's many sellers out there that still will avoid an area after a week or 2 of canvassing because they don't want to go back there because they know what maybe they've sold or missold or misrepresented. I didn't want people to go to sleep with that hanging over them. So yeah, CIP's philosophy around the transparency and the support and the professionalism is that every one of those sellers can go to bed at night peaceful and happy and wake up and be excited for the day. And I wanted to replicate that rather than just me, have 100 of me or more than 100 of me. And so it was LinkedIn, it was getting the message out, private messaging, connecting, and then me running training sessions initially. And then, as we brought in a couple of part-time staff, a couple of students on a year out from uni that needed a year out, some just to work for the summer. It grew to your first full time, and now we've got 17 at head office. So it just one rolls onto the other. But it's all just that stepping stone, really, and take it one step at a time.
To finish off the podcast, Ciaran, because I absolutely love your story. Was there a point at which within the first year, probably especially when you're like pure grind, like pure hustle in terms of like just messaging people on LinkedIn? And I know for a fact that most people just don't reply, but that's just part of the game. But in terms of like, you were living off credit cards at this point, you had a family to provide for. So was there any point like within that first year where you were like, I might have made a mistake here, like I want to go back? Like, was there any doubt in your mind at that point or not?
No, no, no. No, and the worst part that, and I've told this story before, but the hardest time I've had was that first Christmas, because leaving off credit cards, I really couldn't get much at all for Riley as a present. And so that was like the bit that sort of stuck in my mind as like, I've got to get, I've got to build next year. I've got to get to a point where we'll be comfortable in my future. I fully believe that I'll be more comfortable than just sitting in an office and taking a base salary and buying him a couple of Christmas presents. But that was noticeable that Christmas, because that was, credit card territory. And so that stands out, but there was nothing other than that being a driving force, or like pushing me on, propelling me forward to dig my heels in. It was always self-belief. I could just see 1 to 2, 2 to 10, 10 to 100, and that the money would follow. So I've got a lot of friends that go into it as well and expect to be an overnight millionaire or within a year. That was never the case. It's still not the case. We're still on sensible salaries, but you're building a valuable brand and company. So I just know, even now, I know if we continue to do the level that we're doing, the numbers we're doing, process millions of transactions, the money will follow, the revenue will follow, the valuation will follow. So just keep focused on that, on each customer, really.
That's an amazing story, man. Well, I wish you the best of luck. Like, it's
Thank
an
you.
amazing story that you have. Not many people know as well, just from looking at you, looking at your brand, because yeah, especially when it comes to B2B, when like you might not be necessarily the face of the brand as much, although you do put yourself out there. Like, this story doesn't usually come with it. It's like with a lot of like B2C, where like they actually put their face on the brand and they do a lot of like personal branding behind it. The
Yeah.
story becomes more important, I think. But this for me, yeah, is a very good podcast in order to record with you. So thank you so much, Ciaran, for coming on. How can people stay in touch with you and what you're doing?
Yeah, no, really appreciate the time and the feedback there as well. But anytime people want to follow me on LinkedIn or Instagram, you can do on there. I'm on Twitter as well, but not as much. But Instagram and LinkedIn, really, and check out CIP. We're on all social media pages and platforms. So give me a message.